I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. My name is Paul Quigley. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. And just in case you forget, you can just look behind my shoulder here. That's the reason for the banner. You can also see our website address, civilwar.vt.edu, where you can find out about all of our many activities. And the center is based in the history department at Virginia Tech. We're sponsoring tonight's event. We sponsor lectures, conferences, other kinds of events throughout the year. We also fund scholarships, research grants. We do public outreach projects and lots of other stuff besides. So again, check out the website. You can find us on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube as well, and get a sense of the range of our different activities. Over the next couple of months, we've got several more really good, really exciting events to look forward to. In March, and actually starting next week, we've got a series of events that's going to replace our usual annual Civil War weekend. So some of you know, I think, that every March, Virginia Tech hosts a Civil War weekend on campus. It's a really, really successful event. People come, we spend the whole weekend studying the Civil War, learning about the Civil War, hearing from leading Civil War experts. And of course, unfortunately, this year we can't do that in person. So instead, we're going to have a series of panel events, one on each of the next 3 Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So you can find out the link to register at our website. And the theme for the event is resources for war. So we've got 9 speakers altogether, 3 each week, and each speaker is going to address a different kind of resource that Americans needed in order to wage war upon one another. And I've been so impressed by the inventiveness of the speakers as they've come up with their topics. We've got some that you would expect: manpower, ammunition, clothing, horses, but then we've also got lots of intangible resources as well, things like love and information. Again, all things that Americans needed and drew upon as they were fighting the Civil War. So that's something to look forward to in March. And then in April, we've got 2 additional lectures, one on women and slavery in Washington, D.C., and the other on families of Black soldiers in Philadelphia. Both of those lectures in April, as well as tonight's lecture, are part of a series we're doing this year. It's called New Perspectives on the Civil War Era, and it's co-organized by myself and Dr. Caroline Newhall, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the center at the moment. And she's with us tonight, and you'll be hearing more from her later. She and I are going to jointly moderate the Q&A session at the end of tonight's lecture. So today's event, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Laura June Davis as a speaker tonight. She's an assistant professor of history as well as co-chair of women's studies at Southern Utah University. She's got degrees from Cornell, Texas A&M, George Mason, and the University of Georgia. And right now she's working on a book, a fascinating book about sabotage, irregular naval warfare, and masculinity during the Civil War. And of course, that's what tonight's talk is going to draw upon. She's going to speak for about 35, 40 minutes. So it will leave us plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. And the way you can submit your questions is by clicking the Q&A button on Zoom. So you can do that actually at any time. You know, if a question occurs to you during the lecture, type it in. If you want to wait until the end, that's fine as well. Based on past experience, we may not be able to get to them all. We tend to have really engaged audiences who ask lots of great questions. So unfortunately, we sometimes usually cannot get to them all, but we will get to as many as we can. And we're going to wrap up around 7:15 Eastern time. So about an hour and 10 minutes from now. I think that's all I need to say. So now I want to encourage you all to join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Davis to the virtual podium. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining me on a Friday afternoon or evening, depending on what time zone you're in. I want to give a special thank you to Dr. Paul Quigley and Dr. Carolyn Newhall for creating this event and inviting me to speak to you all. So before we kind of get into the bulk of my talk, I wanted to kind of lay the foundation and kind of set us all on the same page. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is what happened in the Civil War during along the Mississippi River. And usually when we think about the Mississippi River and the Civil War, we start with General Winfield Scott's famous Anaconda Plan. And I'm sure some of you have seen the map with the giant snake on it, kind of highlighting the two component parts to the Anaconda Plan, where he's going to blockade the Confederacy along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico, and then they're going to gain complete control of the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River is a component part of this Anaconda Plan because it would then be able to divide the Confederacy in half. And so as the war starts to unfold in 1861 and 1862, we see the United States concentrating a lot of their efforts on the Mississippi River. And they're really launching a two-pronged assault. They're going to come down south from Cairo, Illinois, and they're going to come up north from the Gulf of Mexico and New Orleans. And if I've got any naval history fans or big battle fans in Zoomland, you're probably familiar with some of those key battles on the Mississippi River, things like Island Number 10, the Battle of Memphis, right, what's happening at New Orleans. But of course, the biggest battle is going to be what happens at Vicksburg. Vicksburg is kind of one of those last Confederate holdouts on the Mississippi River. It's known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, and the United States spends a lot of time and effort trying to take Vicksburg, and with repeated efforts, they fail. But in the spring and summer of 1863, Ulysses S. Grant is going to work with the Navy and David Dixon Porter, and they're going to launch a 47-day siege on Vicksburg. And then finally, on July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg falls. And that seemingly gives the United States unfettered access to the Mississippi River. Any last holdouts or forts are going to quickly fall. And Abraham Lincoln even famously says, again, the father of the waters goes unvexed to the sea. And then we usually stop talking about the Mississippi and we focus on other theaters of war. And so what I've been researching and what we're going to talk about today is what happens on the Mississippi River after Vicksburg falls, because the conventional war may end, but that's not the end of the story. There's going to be a rise of pro-Confederate boat burners and saboteurs, what people in the 19th century called naval guerrillas, incendiaries, boat burners. These are all kind of interchangeable terms. But these pro-Confederate sympathizers will target commercial steamboats operating along the lower Mississippi River, so St. Louis down to New Orleans. And they're doing this in order to challenge, thwart, and vex U.S. military operations, transportation, and commerce. So today we're going to kind of talk a little bit about how that unfolds. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen with y'all if this works. So hopefully you all can see that and we're good to go. Yes, I'm getting a thumbs up. Awesome. So we're going to look at Confederate boat burners and naval guerrillas along the Mississippi River. And I want to start by comparing two different boat burning incidents that happen in the Civil War. One happens in May of 1861, shortly after the war begins. And the second one's going to happen after the fall of Vicksburg in August of 1863. And as I'm telling you about these two events, I want you to think about how people respond to them, because the responses are quite distinct. So there we go. I'm going to move this so I can see. So the first event is going to happen in New Orleans, May 6th, 1861. Within weeks of the first volley at Fort Sumter, New Orleans is going to bear witness to an altogether different salvo. On the evening of May 1st, 1861, the docks at Algiers, Louisiana are going to ignite into flames. A fire breaks out aboard a steamboat, General Pike, and the flames soon crumble the General Pike's moorings and those of two neighboring boats, resulting in a blazing procession of vessels down the river. In less than 1 hour, the whipping wind spread the flames with terrific rapidity to 6 more vessels. And then there's kind of this ensuing comedy of errors. The alarm bells never went off. The arriving firemen start running about at random because they don't know what to do. And things are just kind of utterly chaotic. With a cloudy sky above and the dark Mississippi rushing below, the light from the flames reflected luridly down on the city, washing New Orleans in a very eerie glow. Ultimately, 9 different steamboats will be destroyed in this fire: the General Pike, Editor, Granada, Telegram, Baltic, Republic, Madison, Dolly Webb, and Conqueror. And in just a matter of moments, over 4,500 tons of timber had splintered into kindling, thousands of pounds of cotton had emulated, and a combined investment of $28,500 had disintegrated into ash. So this seems like a pretty major disaster, right? It would definitely draw a lot of attention. People probably went to the docks to see it. But yet locals didn't really remark on the event. It didn't seem to draw any local interest or concern. And that's because steamboats tended to catch fire in the 19th century. They just tend to be combustible entities. And so New Orleans, as a port town, is used to these things happening. And they just kind of dismiss it as an accident, not a big deal. So to give you some kind of statistical information, if you're curious, in the antebellum period, about 21% of all river steamboats will burn or explode. Between 1847 and 1857, 232 steamboats caught fire and another 56 exploded. If we're looking at just the western waterways, so really the Mississippi River and her tributaries, between 1816 and 1848, 1,433 people died aboard steamboat fires and explosions. So if you live in New Orleans, you're kind of just inured to this level of violence and chaos, and you just dismiss it as an accident, no big deal. But there's one entity that sees this 9-boat fire and thinks maybe there's something suspicious going on. Maybe it's an act of sabotage and this is intentional. And that's the Cincinnati Daily Press. When they report on the fire, they say it's the work of a quote unquote Negro incendiary. Now, they don't expand on that. So we're not 100% clear what they mean. Is that an African-American? Is that an abolitionist Republican? Is it just somebody who has some dark, nefarious intentions? That we don't know. What we do know is that the Cincinnati Daily Press is saying that this New Orleans fire is in fact deliberate arson and intentional, that it's sabotage. Okay, now we're going to fast forward 2 years. And we're going to get to 1863, right? One of the most costly boat burning disasters is going to happen on August 4th, 1863, and that's the explosion of the roof. Unfortunately, the roof just the day before on August 3rd had gotten some cargo that's going to help create her fire. And that included a whole bunch of timber, some US banknotes and postal currency, as well as a quote unquote immense quantity of bacon. Because bacon seems to make everything better. And in this case, it's going to make the fire much worse because you've got timber, dry timber, you've got, all the grease from the bacon, and then you've got coal sitting directly below 4 US Treasury boxes carrying $2.6 million of US greenbacks that are destined for Ulysses S. Grant's army in the West. If we did that conversion today, it would be over $5 billion. So this is a lot of money that the Ruth is carrying. And this is going to ultimately work against her when she catches this fire. So the Ruth will leave Cairo, Illinois around 11 p.m. on August 4th. Most of the passengers are going to retire to their cabins. They're going to fall into blissful sleep, and all is quiet and calm. Safely away from shore, the Ruth's captain, Benjamin R. Pegram, and a Union paymaster by the name of Nathan Britton are going to take their reprieve along the hurricane deck. So if you look at my map, the hurricane deck is up here in the front of the cabin, in the front of the steamboat, right? So they're hanging out there, they're just talking, they're enjoying the solitude of the evening and kind of that soothing churn of the steamboat. Just before midnight, a man interrupts their interlude with news that a fire had broken out at the opposite end of the boat in a carpenter's shop beneath the ladies' cabin. So the ladies' cabin's approximately here. So the fire is going to break out roughly like down here, lower part of the ship at the complete opposite end of the captain and the paymaster are. Captain Pegram hastily departs to go find first mate James Kane. The warning bells clamored, flames rise quickly over the larboard wheel and the carpenter shop, and things turn quite chaotic. Disturbed from his peaceful repose, First Mate Kane rushes into action without his clothes or his shoes on, so you can tell how rushed and hectic he is. He's trying to put out the flames with water buckets, but nothing's working and the flames just keep rising. And so quickly he's going to have to shift tactics and just focus on rescue. How do we save the boat? How do we save all that government money? How do we save all of our passengers? Before long, smoke will cloak the steamer, passengers start crowding towards the front of the boat, and oxygen and comfort become very precious commodities. Within 20 minutes, the upper portion of the steamer fell into the hull, crashing into all of that Union money. Meanwhile, the Ruth is going to violently steer off course. She's going to collide into some river bluffs, threatening everybody who's aboard ship. And several passengers jump off board about this time. They're trying to get to land if they can. Kane tries to secure the boat to shore via a chain cable, but it just doesn't work. He's not moving quickly enough. Just the fire's growing too much. And then the ship veers back into the water. And so she wasn't close to shore long enough for anybody to be able to save all the government money. So the burning flames, the dense smoke, they're all encircling the steamer. The dark night's turning quite bright, and the smells of hickory, singed wood, and sweat mingle together as the fear of everybody aboard ship is very palpable. Panicked passengers start jumping overboard. They think it's better just to risk the rushing currents than the fire. And the combination of bacon, coal, and wood has creating a heat of a fire that's so intense that it actually fuses iron. The steamer's steam pipe will explode, the wheel stops, and the cable chain drags. And the Ruth is going to float downstream about 2 more miles before she finally sinks into the mud. Now, the Ruth's incineration is utterly devastating. It's thousands of dollars worth of damages in just the ship alone. All of the government money is gone. The $2.6 million has just been turned into ash. And more gruesome is the resulting deaths of 26 people. And that included a Union paymaster, 3 clerks, an African-American woman, and 3 freedmen. Most of the casualties are actually drowning victims rather than falling victim to the fire itself. And only the crew is really the survivors of this fire. And early reports claim that there's no real satisfactory theory as to how the originated, but very quickly locals and newspapers are going to say that it was an intentional act of sabotage and that Confederate naval guerrillas are the perpetrators. A month after the destruction, there's a special court of inquiry into the Ruth's burning. You can't lose that much government money without some sort of investigation, right? And they interview the crew, they're questioning the crew for their loyalties, but no one who'd been aboard ship and survived believed that the fire originated out of misconduct or neglect. They're all pointing to some sort of outside sabotage. Paymaster William H. Jameson declared that there was no doubt that the fire was started either by an incendiary aboard ship or some slow match affixed at Caroy that had been left by a naval guerrilla, and then it would just slowly eventually result in the fire. He even alleged that there had been evidence of a bottle of powder and a large coil fuse that had been found in the carpenter shop where the fire started. Ultimately, the federal government and this official investigation agrees. They agree that it is intentional sabotage. They ruled that, quote, the steamer Ruth was fired by an incendiary, not for the particular purpose, although that may have been an additional object of destroying the public funds on board, but in conformity with what appears to be a plan of the rebels for the destruction of water transportation in the valley of the Mississippi, and thus crippling the movements of our armies. The US Navy will endorse this ruling, and they point to the Ruth to kind of highlight that there's a lot of danger and peril along the Mississippi River. So we see about 1 month after Vicksburg has fallen and the United States seemingly has controlled the river, they're already kind of doubting how much control they have, that there are these saboteurs working against them. And we see, if we compare these two events, right, in 1861, New Orleans, they quickly dismissed the multi-vessel conflagration as just an accident, right? No big deal. But now we're looking at the Ruth explosion in 1863, and it's clearly sabotage, right? There's no room for it to be an accident. And this marks kind of a key shift in how people are pursuing and perceiving riverboat explosions and fires. After Vicksburg and starting in the late summer and early fall of 1863, everything's going to be seen as sabotage or intentional. And this is an example of a headline that you might see. This headline actually comes at the end of the war in 1865, but it's talking about this great boat burning conspiracy, that there are over 35 people involved in it. It goes all the way up to Jefferson Davis, and that they have destroyed over 200 steamers. Now, I'm going to revisit some of these numbers later, but we're starting to see in 1863 this shift in belief that steamboat fires are not accidental, that they are in fact intentional. As early as October 1863, the US Army Chief Quartermaster Robert Allen said that, quote, "There are disloyal men in disguise in every employ of every steamer, and it will be difficult to eliminate them." So we see that 1863 is that turning point. Part of the reason that 1863 is that key turning point is what I've already suggested. It's that fall of Vicksburg, right? When the US claims control over the Mississippi River. And what you might not realize today is that during the Civil War and the time before it, the Mississippi River was really the #1 transportation, trade, and communications network of the United States. So whoever controlled this is going to control trade and commerce, the transportation of troops and supplies, the transportation of people and ideas. It was really, really important. And even though the United States had claimed control of it through conventional warfare, the Confederacy isn't ready to let go of that control, and they're going to shift their focus to irregular naval warfare and sabotage, right? The rebels had really failed to defend the Mississippi River, but that very failure is why they're going to result to irregular naval warfare and guerrilla warfare on the water. So after Vicksburg, the story on the Mississippi doesn't end. It just shifts focus, and it takes on this more sinister posture. And so what we see is in the final 2 years of the war, especially in 1864-65, right, the rebels are going to quite literally blaze a path of resistance down the Mississippi River from St. Louis to New Orleans. That's about 1,190 miles that they're trying to thwart and vex the United States. And commercial steamboats are their target. Now, initially, the boat runners are going to do things like we see with the Ruth. They're going to either leave some sort of explosive device that will allow the ship to explode midstream, or they'll set fire to a single ship. And one of the things that they may be using is the Thomas Courtney Coal Torpedo. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with 19th century language, torpedoes in the Civil War era means some sort of bomb or explosive device. So if you look at this Courtney Coal Torpedo, it looks like a piece of anthracite coal, but really what it is a hollow iron casting that they have then filled with gunpowder and explosives, right? And then they dust it in coal powder so it looks like a legitimate piece of coal. So if a naval guerrilla can get his hands on this, what he might do is sneak aboard ship, deposit this coal torpedo in the coal bunker, and then leave. And then you've got the steamboat engineer who has no idea there is a bomb waiting for him. He shovels the piece of coal into the fire and the ship explodes, right? So this is going to happen quite unintentionally on the part of the engineer, but it's clearly an act of sabotage. Later, starting in 1864, we see that the boat burners are going to shift their tactics. And rather than trying to have a boat mysteriously explode or catch fire midstream, what they're going to do is start to set fire to ships that are in dock in port. And what the boat burners will do is they'll board the ship, they'll set a fire, and then they sneak off. And because steamships are made out of wood, right, it's really easy for one boat to cause other boats nearby to catch fire. And before you know it, you've got 3, 4, maybe 9 boats that have caught fire. So if you look at kind of this chart I've created here, you can see there's a handful of events we think might be intentional pre-Vicksburg. After Vicksburg, there's a substantial number of boat burning events, but most of them are just one boat that catches fire. And then all of a sudden the tactics kind of shift in 1864, where the number of boat burning incidences go down, but the damage goes up because the number of boats they're targeting goes up because these fires are spreading. So there's a shift in tactics that ultimately results in higher damage. And part of that is because as the war is waning on and the US military and government become aware of boat burning, they're putting more patrols out, more police out, more guards on the boats. And so it's a little bit harder for the naval guerrillas to pursue their actions. So now that you have a general idea of what the boat burners are doing, I want to talk about why they're doing this, right? What's going on? Why target commercial steamboats? Why is this kind of their focus? And there's really a whole host of economic, strategic, military, political reasons for these naval guerrillas, these boat burners, these saboteurs, right? The first thing is that they want to challenge US control of the Mississippi River. They want to really prevent or inhibit the US from being able to use the river as an effective waterway for their military. So they want to stop or at least make it difficult for the US to transport men, materiel, supplies to their armies in the West and to their occupying forces in the South. And if we look at the boats that the naval guerrillas are targeting, these are vessels that are known to transport US troops. They are known to carry supplies. So this is public knowledge and they're taking that to their advantage. The naval guerrillas also want to distract the US military from their primary cause, right? They're going to have to shift attention, men, resources, and intelligence away from the battlefields to the Mississippi River, and that's going to help slow down some efforts. And if we look at what's going on with Provost Marshal J.H. Baker or Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, they spend a ton of time and energy and resources trying to identify, locate, arrest, and convict the boat burners, especially those out of St. Louis. When you read the Judge Advocate General papers by Holt, like his frustration just mounts as you keep reading, and you can feel how frustrated he is. The second thing that's motivating these boat burners are economics, right? They just want to disrupt US trade and commerce along the waterway. They want to destroy vessels that have an innate value, but they also are aware that these ships are carrying products that have a value and may or may not have an insurance value as well. And the boat burners want to line their own pockets. It turns out that in the Civil War, boat burning is actually extremely profitable. And that's because the Confederate government incentivizes this type of sabotage. The Confederate Congress in 1864 passes a bill that authorizes the rebel government to pay naval guerrillas up to 60% of the damaged boats' vessels. So if you can prove you've destroyed a boat, you're going to get paid. And we have evidence of some boat burners that were captured in Memphis. They were actually former police officers that turned into naval guerrillas. When they're captured, they have a list of all the boats traveling on the Mississippi River and what their value would be if destroyed. So we know that they're motivated economically. William Murphy also attests to this. William Murphy, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of him. He's a St. Louis boat burner. He testifies that he had received financial rewards from James Seddon, the then Secretary of War, and Edward Fraser, who's another boat burner operating out of St. Louis. When he testifies, he says that he met with President Jefferson Davis, with Secretary of War James Seddon, and with Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin. And according to Fraser, the Confederates paid Fraser, his friend Thomas Clark, his co-conspirator Dillingham, they got $50,000 for doing boat burning. Part of that was $35,000 in Confederate gold, and then they had gotten a $15,000 deposit when they could prove that they destroyed it. So they're making money off of doing this, and that's incentivizing them. Other reasons for participating in boat burning is just Confederate loyalty and sympathy and patriotism. to the United States, to us today, a lot of what these naval guerrillas are doing seems to be savage and nefarious, cowardly, but the boat burners really saw themselves as patriots, taking explosive action on behalf of the Confederacy. After his capture, William Murphy boasted that he had, quote, fought for the Confederacy 4 years and have done all I could to help it. I would do all I could again, as long as I have an inch of ground to stand upon. J.W. Tucker agreed. He said, quote, I feel as intensely as it is possible to feel the vital necessity of striking hard blows now and striking at as many points and as many ways as possible so as to aid our cause and to save our country. So you can see these boat burners are really casting themselves as legitimate and patriotic Confederate warriors. Murphy at his trial says, we're not any different than soldiers, right? The hiring of men to burn steamboats is no more of a conspiracy than hiring of soldiers to shoot men on the battlefield. So they are participating in the war effort just in a different way than we conventionally think about. And the final reason that the boat burners are doing what they're doing has to do with psychological warfare and invoking terror, right? They intentionally are trying to scare people. They operate in the shadows. We know that most of the fires happen in the middle of the night or while ships are traveling midstream. And this is intentional to invoke fear and terror amongst the US population, especially those who live along the waterways or in major port towns. And this letter that I've excerpted for you here is from W.S. Oldham to Jefferson Davis. It's from February 11th, 1865. And the part I've highlighted is where he's saying that what they're doing will be effective in invoking fear. He says that the rebels should, quote, burn every transport and gunboat on the Mississippi River, as well as devastate the country of the enemy and fill his people with terror and consternation. So this is done intentionally to invoke fear, and they're aware that that's what they're going to do. Okay, so we know what they're doing roughly. We know why they're doing it. Who are they, right? Who are the boat burners? As much as I wish that there was a magical list of all the boat burners, that does not exist. The United States was able to identify 19 Confederate boat burner agents operating out of St. Louis. And by the end of the war, they will expand that to a network of 35 people, including Jefferson Davis. If we take a look at the known Confederate boat burners, we have kind of a composite sketch, right? They are a Confederate sympathizer from a river town, most likely St. Louis, New Orleans, Memphis, or Mobile. They likely have some connection to the steamboat world. They might have been a deckhand, an engineer, a painter, a pilot, or a mate. And if they hadn't had a prior experience with steamboats, they're part of the greater wolf culture. Some of them owned hotels or saloons. There's a couple of politicians and newspapermen. He's most likely a he, as much as I keep trying to find a female boat burner, that has not happened yet. And he's most likely white, although at least one alleged boat burner had dark skin and another purportedly wore dark face in order to disguise his appearance. Above all, he has strong ties to his community, either by virtue of his position or his gregarious nature. And this serves him well because his friends and supporters can help aid him in his nefarious actions or hide him away and secret him away when the US government's looking for him. We know that boat burners are kind of an altogether different and unique type of guerrilla fighter. They operate along the margins and the shorelines and the waterways, right? When you think of guerrilla fighters, you probably think of like Bloody Bill Anderson or William Quantrell, but these people are known, right? They flaunt their exploits. Bushwhackers are known for those big, colorful, flamboyant shirts. Partisan rangers operated under the authority of the Confederate government. But boat burners are different, right? These naval guerrillas operate in the shadows. They skulk along the docks. They secret themselves aboard ships, or maybe on a few occasions, they insinuate themselves as a member of a crew. If they do their job correctly, you didn't know they were there. You have no evidence that they were there until the boat blows up or explodes, right? We believe that most naval guerrillas probably acted alone or in small groups, twos or threes. If you look at the arrest records, they tend to be solos. Some do and trios. And that makes sense. You might have somebody, on the docks keeping an eye while you board the ship to leave your incendiary device. But we also know that there's evidence of an organized gang operating out of St. Louis. And this is the network that the United States government identifies. William Murphy, he's a member of this organized gang outside of St. Louis, gave a full confession to Provost Marshal J.H. Baker. According to Murphy, Edward Frazier led this band of 19 agents in a mission to destroy federal property and steamboats. And by war's end, Frazier himself gave a full confession. Likely, he confessed so he himself wouldn't be imprisoned. According to Frazier, it was actually Minor Majors who's the true mastermind of the conspiracy. And in the end, the Provost Marshal's office says that they think Judge Tucker's the #1 guy in charge of St. Louis. He's the ringleader, and he's operating directly under Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon, right? So that's what we know about them. In terms of overall impact, right? The boat burners are pretty effective in their effort to destroy commercial steamboats. I've been able to confirm at least 40 steamboats have been damaged. That's a total tonnage of about 13,300. The value of just the steamboats themselves is over $1 million, and that's 1860s dollars. And the value of the property is unknown, but we're talking multiple millions of dollars worth of property that's lost. And at least 261 people died in these fires. So overall, there is some definite impact in what these boat burners are doing, and their sabotage is pretty effective. Secondly, they end up kind of redefining what warfare looks like in the Civil War, especially if we think about naval warfare. As early as the fall of 1863, newspapers are reporting about this quote unquote new style of rebel warfare, right? What I like to think of naval guerrilla warfare. And this article from October of 1863 says that the rebels have, quote, organized a gang of incendiaries to burn the steamers on the Mississippi River. And that would have excited little attention and less belief did not the facts indicate the truth of it. It is evident that the rebels intend to do by treachery what they are unable to do by fair contest, keep the Mississippi clear of federal steamers. So not only are they effective in their destruction, but now they're redefining what warfare looks like. From the Confederate boat burner perspective, this is legitimate warfare. From the United States perspective, this is just utter treachery, savagery. This would not be considered legitimately. Most importantly is that these saboteurs are able to convince the United States that they are way more successful than they actually are, right? They convince people that the boat burning conspiracy is way more substantial than we are actually able to confirm. So if you think about that newspaper heading that I showed earlier, that article talks about how during the war, there were over 200 steamers of all kinds. They valued from $15,060 to over $150,000 each. This is part of this chivalrous band of perpetrators. And that has resulted in not only a huge pecuniary loss to the government, but the sacrifice of hundreds of valuables of lives. So they're saying 200, right? They're saying this many boats. And I'm saying I've only been able to confirm 40, right? That's a huge difference, 40 versus 200. But at the end of the day, whether or not they actually destroyed 200 vessels isn't as important as the fact that they convince people that they have destroyed 200 vessels. So that whole effort to invoke fear and terror has been widely successful. And when you look at the headlines in the newspapers in 1865 about the conspiracy going all the way up to Jefferson Davis and including over 35 people, that's because the government and the military are trying to connect Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government to a whole host of conspiracies. That the assassination of Abraham Lincoln is part of this, that the boat burning is part of this, that all of these other acts of sabotage are indicative of an overall war aim of the Confederacy that is utilizing nefarious kind of questionable war tactics. So from my perspective, right, the fact that they convince people that they've destroyed 200 vessels, even though they haven't, is extremely telling to how successful they are in their fear and terror campaign. Now, I want to leave you with one final thought, and I'm trying to anticipate where I think one of your questions might go. And that has to do with the legacy of the boat burners and the Sultana explosion. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Sultana, it is the worst maritime disaster in US history. It took place on April 27th, 1865. More people die in the Sultana than in the Titanic. What happens is the Sultana is a commercial steamship. She's traveling north from Vicksburg, and she's got 2,137 passengers aboard ship. She's only supposed to have 376, but she's got, almost 2,000 more people than that. She also has a poorly patched boiler, and so things are not in her favor. Tragically, a lot of the passengers aboard the Sultana are actually surviving prisoners of war who've recently been paroled. So some of these people have literally survived the horrors of Andersonville, or they've been at other prisons like Cahaba. They're aboard the ship. They're trying to get home, right, and end their war experience. So on the Sultana is just south of Memphis, and then 3 out of her 4 boilers explode. 1,168, or that's our best approximation, people died. So there's going to be, of course, an official investigation to this huge tragedy. The government rules that it's a mismanagement of operating the ship, as well as just a horrible tragedy. There had been the faulty boilers. They had not been properly repaired. There had been a mismanagement of the water levels in the boilers. And then you have this huge overcrowding of the ship that had weighted down, and she was really top heavy. You take all these things into effect, and it's just a tragic disaster. Nobody's talking about this being naval guerrillas. No one's talking about this being an act of sabotage. Fast forward 20 years to 1888. In 1888, all of a sudden, there are these headlines in the Memphis Daily Appeal and the St. Louis Globe-Democrat that are talking about the Sultana as being intentional, of being sabotaged, and that they have identified the perpetrator, and he's the quote unquote murderer of an age. And so they're talking about Charlie Deal. According to May 6th, 1888, St. Louis Globe-Democrat article, the true cause of the disaster had finally been explained, that this Charlie Deal, this local St. Louis painter, had sabotaged the steamship by strategically placing a coal torpedo in front of the ship's boilers when she'd been docked at the wharfs in Memphis. And this is all coming to light through supposed testimony by William Streeter. We're not hearing from Charlie Deal, we're hearing from William Streeter, who supposedly know Charlie Dale. Streeter is a painter and a Civil War clerk who worked in the Gratiot and Myrtle Street prisons. So Streeter says that Dale was at the time, quote, a young, vigorous devil. He possessed bravery of a certain kind, equal to that of any man who'd ever lived, and he was cool and calculating in his disposition. Supposedly, Streeter and Dale had met up after the war. They were talking about boat burning, and all of a sudden Dale drunkenly confesses that he's the perpetrator behind the Sultana, that he had fired on no less than half a dozen steamboats. And so within a few days, in 1888, now all of a sudden, newspapers across the United States, including the New York Times, are printing stories about how the Sultana is an act of intentional sabotage, that it was an act of naval guerrilla warfare. So, is this true? Who is Charlie Dale? Did he really do this? Charlie Dale is not a real person. It's an alias for Robert Louden. Now, Robert Louden was a known boat burner in the Civil War. He's even tried and convicted for both boat burning and mail running. He's kind of a dark, lean man. He's about 5 foot 960 pounds, dark hair, blue eyes. He was well known in St. Louis in the Civil War era. He'd been a volunteer fireman, a street inspector, a steamboat painter, and a pilot. And he was also part of St. Louis's underworld. He had been known to frequent gambling halls, saloons, bordellos. And he has a lot of pseudonyms. That's why he's operating under this alias. So he's Robert Louden, which is spelled Louden, but sometimes you see his name spelled with a W, sometimes he's Bob Louden, Robert Sidon, Charlie Deal, Charlie Dale, right? All sorts of aliases and pseudonyms. After the war, he becomes a painter and he dies of yellow fever in 1867. So Charlie Dale isn't even his right name to begin with, right? So after we look at that, do we think that Robert Louden, aka Charlie Dale, actually blew up the Sultana and did this intentional act of sabotage? I'm going to argue no, right? The evidence is overwhelmingly against this being a true conspiracy or act of sabotage. First of all, if you look at the government reports, right, they say that it's all the overcrowding of the ship, the faulty boilers. Historians and scholars have revisited these reports over the years, and everybody agrees, right? This is what happened. It's just a tragic accident, some mismanagement, overcrowding of ship. Secondly, is if you start to look at Loudon's character, there's a lot of questions and red flags, right? He's known for being a storyteller. He's known for being a heavy drinker. He's known for cavorting around. Like, few people at the time would have believed him. Thirdly, Robert Loudon's really good friend and mail running partner published his memoirs, and that's Absalom Grimes. You can read his memoirs. And Grimes talks about what Loudon's up to during the Civil War. He talks about boat burning exploits, and he doesn't mention the Sultana. So you think that someone's really good friend and partner who's already talking about boat burning would address the Sultana if this was a true story. Fourthly is like the whole timing of 1888 and when these articles come out is really suspicious, right? It's 20 years after the fact. You're getting it like from hearsay, from secondhand, from William Streeter. And if you start to pay attention to the timing, this is when they start to create the Sultana Survivors Associations, and all the survivors of the explosion are actually having reunions. And so when you find these reprints of the article, they're almost side by side with stories about the survivors having their reunions. So it's more likely that Streeter saw this news, wanted his 5 seconds of fame, and comes up with this story, right? And Loudon's dead, so he can't confirm or deny it. And when you look at the New York Times reprint of the story, they add their own subheading that kind of shows how questionable they think it is. They said it was, quote, a mystery of the war claiming to be solved. They don't actually believe it. And my last piece of evidence of why I don't think the Sultana is included in what the boat burners does is looking at Robert Loudon's own words. When we look at what he said while he was imprisoned and being questioned, if we look at his correspondence, the limited that we have, to his family, if we look at his testimony in the trial, he never once admitted to being a boat burner. He admits to being a mail runner, he admits to all other crimes, but he's always trying to claim that he wasn't part of the boat burning conspiracy, even though the evidence is overwhelmingly against him. So I find it really suspicious that a man who's supposedly denying actively that he's a boat burner is just going to randomly drunkenly confess to it one night. So no, I don't think the Sultana is included in this. I don't think that Robert Louden is a devious saboteur. But the fact that people believe this story to be true 20 years after the fact reinforces how successful the boat burners had been during the war. Fear had been one of their greatest weapons, and the impact of that fear and terror clearly still lingered on in people's minds. And I think that's why they believed it. So I'm going to stop there because I know you all have lots of questions. But you may feel free to find me on various places. I've got my Twitter handle, my website, and my LinkedIn profile. So if I don't get to your questions and you still have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to talk to you all. But I'm going to stop sharing now.
You'd think by now I'd know not to keep myself muted. Sorry about that. Well, we've got some great questions so far, so I'll dive right in. But we've seen a few coming in from several different people asking about the breadth, I think, of the experience of boat burners. Have you found any evidence beyond the Mississippi, the Tennessee River, the Ohio, other locations like that? Have you seen any evidence of boat burners that are more widespread beyond just the Mississippi, or have you been very much relegated to looking at that particular arena?
So geographically, I focus my research predominantly on the Mississippi River because I find that to be a very fascinating theater of war. But there are a handful of incidences that I've seen on some of the more eastern rivers, like the James River. I haven't really explored that option, but there are at least a few instances that are happening in the east. But for the most part, statistically, it seems to be focused more on the Mississippi River. And I think that's for two main reasons. One is if you think about the geography of the United States, eastern rivers go east-west, but once we start to get more west, they go north-south, right? And so control of those rivers is very important because they can give you a direct pathway into enemy territory. Whereas in the east, right, they tend to be more geographical barriers. The other reason that I think it's more prominent on the Mississippi River is because the Mississippi River was so central in people's minds as being that essential transportation, trade, commerce, communications network. And so it's just more pertinent in people's minds. And a lot of those big port towns are on the Mississippi River as to some of those other eastern towns. I've dealt a little on some of the tributaries of the Mississippi River, and there are a handful of boat burning river incidences on those as well, but it's definitely focused more on the west than in the east.
Great, thank you.
Another question that came up in a variety of ways from different people concerns how far up did this conspiracy or activity go? And you mentioned, rumors that Jefferson Davis was involved. You showed us at least one letter that one of these guys wrote to Jefferson Davis. Did this reach up to the highest levels of the Confederate government? Or, as one other person asked, were the boat burners really independent actors who obviously were doing what they felt was best for the Confederate war effort, but didn't have a connection to the official war effort?
So I think it's both. It depends, right? I think if you look at the organized gang of boat burners operating out of St. Louis, right, they're almost like a proto-terrorist network. So you've got like one person in charge, and then they've got all their little cells. And two of the boat burners that are captured are part of that gang, and they never talk about or reference each other in their trials. So you could actually be part of that group and not know about each other. The St. Louis gang is definitely talking to the Confederate government, right? They report back that they've gone to the Confederacy in Richmond, that they've met with Seddon and maybe Benjamin or even Davis, that they're being paid out. And so there are some higher level connections. And I think that also ties into the fact that the Confederate government had passed that 1864 bill that's really kind of opening the doors to all different acts of sabotage. And if you could prove that you burned a boat like the Ruth or some of these others, you could be financially paid out and incentivized. So there are some of those connections. I think it's probably happening more at the cabinet level than all the way up at the Davis level, but there are some connections to the Confederate government. But I think that's mainly true for that organized gang. I think a lot of these boat burners that are operating by themselves or in kind of duos or trios, a lot of these anonymous figures that we can't identify, we just kind of hear reports about them. I think they're operating more in isolation and kind of like, this is how I can contribute to the Confederacy. This is how I can do important work. Or, hey, maybe I just really like setting fires and this is a good excuse to do that. We know of at least one boat burner who talks about this. He's like, she made a real pretty fire, right? So some of them are kind of doing things by themselves and individually. So I think both answers are correct.
Yeah, we're also getting a few questions about the evidence you've been finding to link these discussions between boat burners and the powers that be, and where are you finding this evidence? What kind of evidence are you finding that's been most compelling for you?
So it gets complicated, right? Because if you start at like the official records and some of the stuff that the provost marshal is saying, they're looking at like 200 boats, 35 people. The newspapers are saying that. And then it's like, how do I find a list of all the boats that they've targeted? And is that true or not? So I kind of started in multiple directions and then intersected and checked and verified. So we've got provost marshal records that talk a lot about trying to hunt down, identify the boats, list the boats that have been targeted, and they have various lists of people and boats, and you can find some of that in the official records. We've got the Judge Advocate General records, especially Joseph Holt, talking about what he's doing. And then there's the, for those of you who are into maritime history, there's the Holt-Camper-Lido list. It's literally a list of all the steamboats that are operating in this time period. And so I looked and said, okay, who's on the Mississippi River? And did it say, was it a fire or it exploded? And then I start cross-referencing and delving into a lot of newspaper records and other government records to say, is it a fire? Is it not? Is it intentional? Is it not? What's going on? And so there's a lot of kind of intersecting of those sources just to identify the boats that are being targeted. And there are definitely a few incidences, I should say, where people are claiming that it's sabotage and the evidence is against them. It's actually negligence on the part of the crew, but they're aware of this boat burning conspiracy and they try to excuse their actions. Then if we're looking for correspondence and how they're working with the Confederate government, which I think is what some of y'all are asking, the most compelling evidence that we get comes from two trials. Robert Louden and William Murphy. They are the two boat burners that are part of the St. Louis gang. They are found and they are tried. And so we have all of this testimony and evidence that comes to light during their court-martial procedures. Even though they are civilians, they are tried by the military courts in St. Louis. So they are both found guilty. They are both sentenced. Robert Louden actually escapes. There's a prisoner transport and he's able to escape that way. William Murphy will end up serving part of his sentence, and then after the war, his sentence is vacated by a Supreme Court justice who's doing his big, circuit ride, because he says Murphy was not supposed to be tried by the military court. He should have been tried by a civilian court, and so on that technicality, he's released. The other big piece of compelling evidence is surprisingly in the assassination trials and investigations tied to the Lincoln assassination. That's where we get Edward Fraser's testimony about his participation in the St. Louis gang, how he was meeting up and talking with the Confederacy. And so he's giving testimony to his experiences in Richmond, talking to the Confederate government. So the number one places I'm getting that evidence about the connections to the Confederate government are those trials and proceedings.
Yeah, the research process must have been really interesting. I was thinking about that too, because on the one hand, as you mentioned, while they're doing these things, these guys are trying to hide what they're doing and not leave any evidence. And yet afterwards, they want to inflate what they've done and claim that they have done things which they haven't. So it's like, what do you trust when you're doing the research?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about that. And so I try to stick to what is contemporary to the time and what people are reporting back on. And at least I think in the trial proceedings, they're often downplaying what they're doing, right? And they're trying not to admit to it. William Murphy confesses because he's trying to get a relatively low sentence from the government, but then he escapes and the government recaptures him. And so when he actually faces his sentencing, it's much stricter. And like I said, Louden never wants to confess to what he's done, even though when they find him, they actually find him in a bordello. He's like gambling, and there's all these like evidence and letters on his person when they capture him. So it's really hard to refute the evidence when he's carrying it, but he tries to not even admit. He's like, I've done bad things, but I haven't done those bad things. So yeah, there's a lot of times where like I want it to be true and it's not, and it would make my story more exciting, but I try to stick with the lower number because I've been able to confirm that. I suspect that number of 40 is actually low, but I've tried to go with what only I could verify. I think 200 is way too far the other way.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Just a fascinating process of figuring all that out. One question concerns boat building technology and specifically ironclad technology. Did that make any difference to the practice of naval sabotage on the rivers?
So the ironclad technology is really going to be focused more on like the official boats that the US Navy and the Confederate Navy are using. That has not at this time period really transferred over to commercial steamboats. And I think that may be part of one of the many reasons the boat burners are targeting commercial steamboats. They're made out of wood, they're more innately combustible. And I have not come across any records of people talking about shifting the designs of steamboats. What we do see, is, especially in St. Louis, is calls for more protection. And so they will actually start putting like curfews out for crews and when ships can leave port or dock when they can't. There'll be a call for more police, and that would even include patrol boats, as well as more police on the docks, a heavier naval presence. So they're doing more of those types of protection than physically protecting the boats with ironclad technology. I mean, we have to remember, while technically there are a few other instances of ironclads pre-Civil War, the Civil War is really the first war where you see a massive rise in ironclad technology and ironclads fighting one another. So that's very new and innovative, and it's going to take a while before it would trickle down outside of the military. I love all this. Great job, y'all. What else?
Oh, it looks like we may have lost Caroline. So I'll continue with the questions. So somebody asked, I think kind of picking up on the Sultana example, were there other examples that actually did happen, in your opinion, where boats that were carrying wounded soldiers were targeted by these guys?
Oh, I have not come across a whole lot of that. It seems like if you look at the stats, fall of 1863 and early 1864 are really the height of the boat burning incidences. They really start to fade out into 65. It would not surprise me if there were acts of sabotage on other vessels of returning soldiers, especially if the boat runners got wind of that, because they definitely are intentional in targeting boats. Like I said, I found like a lot of the boats that they target, you can find evidence of them carrying troops. There's one boat that gets like, there are 3 different attempts to destroy it. So the fact that they keep going after this one steamboat, again, I think suggests there's some intentionality of it. But the boat burning efforts really seem to fade as the war fades. So we don't come across a lot of after war intentional evidence. I've kept looking, I try to look at least until 1866, but I haven't been able to find any evidence. Doesn't mean it didn't happen or it didn't exist, but I haven't been able to confirm it yet.
I think we're getting some cool questions about their status as guerrillas and the way that boat burners are terming themselves, before the war and after, or during the war and after the war. And a question about, can they be seen as terrorists in our modern parlance? How would we conceive of this relationship between boat burners and, say, the land warfare guerrilla action that's going on, particularly around Missouri and with Kirby Smith?
Right. I definitely think the boat runners are an example of guerrilla fighters. I think it's just they take it to the water as opposed to the land. And that's one of my secret goals, is to convince everybody that maritime matters and what happens on the water has value. And I did publish a piece, an essay about this in a book about guerrilla fighting. It's called The Guerrilla Hunters. It's a series of essays. It was edited by Barton Myers and Brian D. McKnight. And so I have successfully convinced other guerrilla scholars that the boat burners count as a type of guerrilla fighters. And I've also kind of convinced them that we have to rethink the geography of guerrilla warfare. At the time, the term that they most often use is boat burners, if they're referring to themselves. Newspapers use boat burners, incendiaries interchangeably. Naval guerrillas is a more rare term, but it does happen, especially in some of the naval and military documents. Like at the top, it'll say naval guerrillas on it. So they are starting to make that linkage that this is somehow a type of irregular warfare, just one we haven't thought of. And naval guerrilla warfare is something that scholars are starting to explore in other time periods as well. The term terrorist doesn't exist yet in the Civil War, but I think you could definitely consider them to be proto-terrorists, especially since we've got that old hymn letter where he's saying, I want to invoke fear and terror and consternation. And so I think we can definitely consider them on a spectrum. Not completely related to this question, but I think it helps relate to why we could sort of use that terminology is more recently, in I think it was 2014, there were actually some trials of some Al-Qaeda terrorists that in their Amici Curiae briefs referred to the trials of Robert Louden and William Murphy. So even in some modern day legal standings, there's some connections there. And so I think if we're trying to use our modern day understandings, we can use those terms like naval guerrilla or terrorist, just understanding that terrorist isn't a term they would use.
One question concerns the coal torpedoes, and you showed us the image, just fascinating design of a weapon. And so do you have any idea as to whether they were used in other contexts, you know, whether that be other wars or other kinds of fights?
I know during the Civil War, they are also used to help destroy locomotives, and they're probably more often used on railroads than on steamboats. At the time, it's a relatively new technology, and so it is kind of hard to get your hands on it, but there is kind of a greater network of Confederate saboteurs that are trying to get their hands on the Courtney torpedo. I have not actually looked at if similar explosive devices like the Coal Torpedo are used in later wars, but I think you can draw a line from like the Coal Torpedo to like an IED today, right? Something that's kind of disguised and you don't know it's there until it blows up. So I think there's definitely a continuum on the types of hidden explosive devices that are happening. But yeah, I'm not aware of them happening, because remember, the United States isn't going to fight another major war until the Spanish-American War, and so, you know, that's almost what 30 years later, and technology is dramatically changing. I haven't come across them using the Coal Torpedo there, but I suspect they were using other types of explosive devices.
Yeah, well, I guess somebody needs to write a history of the Coal Torpedo. What an amazing weapon.
Yeah.
Agreed. Actually, to jump on that point and that question, someone was asking about the images that you're using to, you know, how people depicted these explosions, this sabotage. Are those romanticized images to your knowledge, or are they pretty close to what it would have generally looked like given?
So most of them are contemporary newspapers that I was using. So these were like, as soon as the event was happening, it's being reported on, is those, a lot of where those drawings are coming from. And so I think they're trying to be as accurate as possible. I think they don't really have the time to romanticize them. And I think they're trying to highlight just how devastating and damaging they were. But I know at least one was from Frank Leslie. I think one was from Harper's Weekly. So almost all of the images where I have a boat exploding, there was one exception to that. Almost all of them are happening almost instantaneously. When I talked about that first fire in New Orleans, I don't have a picture of that. So I pulled a picture that was made in the 1840s of when the St. Louis fire happened, because it was the best picture of a lot of boats on fire that I could find. But again, that was contemporary to when the St. Louis fire happened. So I don't think they're romanticized, is the short answer.
So one of the big themes of your talk, of course, was the huge importance of the Mississippi River to the Civil War in general. And so we've got a couple of questions about that. And one of them takes the approach of asking, you know, since the Mississippi River was so important, why were the Confederates not kind of doing this every day? Why weren't they burning all the boats? And another question asks, what else were they doing after they had lost kind of official naval control of the Mississippi River? Were there other ways they were trying to regain that control?
Yes. So a lot of this boils down to technology, capability, and manpower, right? Like, if the Mississippi was so important, why didn't the Confederacy successfully defend it, right? Part of it is the fact that they don't have a Navy to start out with, right? They have a bunch of sailors who resigned from the US Navy and not a single boat. So I like to say that they literally duct tape a Navy together. They're buying boats, converting boats. I mean, the Memphis River Defense Fleet is like a hodgepodge boat. Series of crafts trying to defend. And so they didn't have that capability or ships or manpower to defend the Mississippi to begin with. And I think that's why they resort to guerrilla violence. Other things that are happening along the Mississippi River that are, I think, highlighting that effort to try to thwart control is we do see acts of conventional guerrilla warfare. There are guerrillas that are firing onto boats from shore. So they'll take their guns and they'll fire on boats, and they are successful at times in disrupting commerce, upsetting, frustrating people, killing people. I don't count them because I like to think of the boat burners as a different category, but there are acts of conventional guerrilla warfare that's happening. And just thinking about some of the everyday actions of the Confederate populace as they're thwarting US occupation, right? I always think of the women in New Orleans who are disrespecting the US troops who are stationed there, right? And Butler has to issue his infamous women's order, right? General Orders number 28. Like, if you don't behave and respect us, we're going to treat you like prostitutes and essentially manhandle you. So we're seeing acts of defiance by everyday people in that regard as well, because they are resentful of the US occupation, because they are frustrated by the US trying to control and occupy this waterway and this region that has a lot of Southern ties to it. So off the top of my head, those are some examples that I have of other things that are going on. But overall, the Confederacy is suffering from just a lack of manpower, a lack of technology and shifts. When we talk naval war in the Civil War, we often talk about it being asymmetric because the US is just so much stronger than the Confederacy. And that's why the Confederates are more apt to pursue innovative and experimental things like the Courtney torpedo, like trying to establish a submarine. They're willing to take more risks because, quite frankly, that's the only hope they have.
I lost some of the questions because I got kicked off at one point. There was a good one about gender. Paul, do you think you could find that? I believe it was from Angela about the relationship for gender and boats. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
so
the gender of boats or the gender of the boat burners?
Both.
Both.
and also the connection between the two, I think, and thinking about your theme of manhood among the boat burners versus the boats having feminine names and being referred to as she. The connections there.
So in the 19th century, boats were feminized, right? They were always referred to as she. It was in the early 2000s. I'm probably going to get the year wrong. I think it was 2004, but don't quote me. There was actually like an international decision to stop referring to boats as feminine, and they became gender neutral. But that's like our lifetime, right? The boats have stopped being referred to as she. And I do find this whole gender dynamic of boats fascinating. The fact that they are she, and yet their crews are pretty much exclusively male. Their captains are male, right? If we look at the US Navy or the Confederate Navy, they're all male. The boat burners are all male. So you have these men that are trying to wrestle control of these feminine entities. And that's an interesting juxtaposition there, especially as they're trying to essentially prove their strength and their manhood and their power and their control over these feminine entities. It's a fascinating juxtaposition. They don't talk as much about that as I would like. So like, it's an intuitive argument, but it's not always one that we have the evidence to make. What's more apt is them describing the fact that especially the boat burners, they're trying to justify that what they're doing is in fact legitimate and manly, that it's not somehow effeminate or weak or nefarious, that they are legitimate men working on behalf of the Confederacy. In terms of the boat burners themselves, like I said, I keep trying to find a female boat burner. She does not seem to exist yet. But what I do know is that there are women that are part of the greater boat burning network, right? And so like the bordello that Robert Louden is found in when he's caught, that was owned by a woman. Kate, I know that there were women that were visiting Robert Louden in prison, not his wife. His wife actually gets in trouble for mail running, and she's been banished to the South and the Confederacy at this time period. Louden also refuses to tell his wife, Mary, what he's up to because he's afraid she'll gossip and tell everyone. So other women are helping Robert Louden out, like they're feeding him, they're taking care of his laundry. And so we know that if we think of women often being the quartermasters of the irregular war, and you know, other historians have done a great job of targeting that. I think that's true for the naval guerrilla war as well, that we're seeing the boat burners being supported by a greater network that includes women that are helping to support them, supply them, hide them away, secret them. So if we look at the greater umbrella community, women are definitely there. They don't seem to be setting fire to the boats. Although a lot of the fires happen in the ladies' cabin and the women's cabin. And so there's the possibility there. I just haven't proven it yet.
Wow. Well, this is fascinating. And I'm just really sorry that we're out of time now, because I've enjoyed so much listening to you, both the talk itself, but just the superb responses to the questions. I want to thank the audience members for bringing such great questions to the table. I think that promoted a really, really interesting discussion after the lecture itself. So thanks to everyone for coming along tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time, and especially Dr. Davis for giving us such a wonderful talk and sharing her expertise. Thank you and good night. Hope to see you at another event soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.